Hey, everybody, welcome back. I'm Susan Linder, your host of the Innovation Storytellers Show. And this is going to be a show that I'm going to ask you to buckle up, put on your helmet, and get ready for the test flight of a lifetime, because this is probably one of the most exciting shows I think I've ever done. And the reason for that is I feel so closely connected with the people inside of a little known university that you've never heard of before. And I'm going to let my guests share a little bit more about it. I'm so thrilled, more than thrilled. I'm honored to welcome my guests today from the US Air Force and Blue Horizons. Now, we're going to get a little bit deep today. We're going to get into things that really matter to the center of innovation. And it starts right here in the US, in our homeland. So let me introduce you to my incredible guests today. The first is Colonel Daniel Ruttenberg, who is the Deputy Director, Center for Strategy and Technology, and an Associate Professor and Instructor for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force's Blue Horizons Fellowship. Unhindered by conventional thinking and processes, Blue Horizons is part think tank, part incubator, molding battle-ready entrepreneurs capable of taking aggressive action to exploit emerging strategic opportunities. With service as a KC-135RT formal training unit evaluator and instructor pilot, Colonel Ruttenberg has spearheaded global reach with worldwide mobility impact. A total force veteran, he was instrumental in the activation of the 99th Air Refueling Squadron as an air refueling associate unit with the Alabama Air National Guard. A weapons school graduate with academic and flying honors, Colonel Ruttenberg commanded combat operations and special operations air refueling missions in support of Operations Noble Eagle, Iraqi Freedom, New Dawn, and Enduring Freedom. Colonel Ruttenberg was the commander of the Air Force's inaugural KC-46 Squadron and Formal Training Unit, and is an advanced air advisor with Global Security Force Assistance experience. He commanded the 621st Air Mobility Advisory Group, Travis Air Force Base, California, and Joint Base McGuire-Dix, Lakehurst, New Jersey, spearheading global employment of U.S. Air Force air advisors, air mobility liaison officers, and air mobility operations experts spanning 5 squadrons and 21 operating locations across the globe. Welcome, Colonel.
Thank you, Susan.
And I'd like to introduce as well Eric Keels, who is an Associate Professor of International Security and the Curriculum Coordinator in the Blue Horizons program at Air War College. While at Blue Horizons, he has advised on projects related to jet fuel generation from carbon capture, data management, integrating non-kinetic effects, enterprise-wide talent management, and 3D printing drones to rapidly disrupt our adversaries' decision-making. Outside of his work in Blue Horizons, he leads policy-relevant research on armed conflict. Prior to working at Blue Horizons, he coordinated research on political violence at One Earth Future Foundation and was a postdoctoral research fellow in global security at the Howard H. Baker Center for Public Policy at the University of Tennessee. Welcome, Eric.
It's great to be here.
I am so thrilled to have you here. And full disclaimers, Eric, will you share with us these disclaimers, please?
Yeah, so first off, we do not represent the U.S. Air Force or Department of Defense in this conversation. And the things said today do not represent the official policies or opinions of the U.S. Air Force or Department of Defense.
That's right. And yet, we're still going to have a phenomenal conversation.
Yeah, we hope so.
So give us a little bit of background in how Blue Horizons came to be to begin with. How did this come about?
So Blue Horizons emerged as a academic program. It was an elective taught at Air War College for a number of years and then became its own individual program. And then under General Goldfein, we were presenting papers that were thinking about this intersection of strategy and technology and what the future of warfare might look like. And General Goldfein, who was the chief of staff of the Air Force at the time, said, this is all really awesome. This is impressive work that you guys are doing, but can you give us a little bit more fidelity on what the future will actually look like? Rather than writing these papers, is there any way that you can actually test and prototype some of these solutions so that it's easier for us to transition these ideas? And the leadership at the time were like, of course we can do this, despite the fact that we had no experience with prototyping or the complications of government contracting at the time. So it was a steep learning curve, but around 2017, we made the transition to officially operating as an incubator for national security. So Blue Horizons as an organization each year selects between 12 to 14 talented majors and lieutenant colonels from across the Air Force, Space Force, Air National Guard, and they are tasked with identifying strategic level challenges and then identifying potential technological or strategic opportunities, primarily within academia or the private sector, that we can leverage to bring some more insight as to whether we can address these massive Herculean challenges. And for context, it's a 10-month program, and 4 of those 10 months are really spent looking around corners and trying to figure out like what can be done. That just leaves 6 months to go from a napkin drawing to a live test and prototype and hopefully a transition partner, which is a timeline that not many people would sign up for, at least not in good conscience, sober, I would say.
Right. And, you know, in the commercial world, we think about it having an internal advocate, someone who's really going to shepherd a breakthrough innovation all the way to the finish line, which is not easy to get people to invest their political capital inside of an organization, their budget, their resources, their time, even knowing that teams might be flat out at 100%. We still need to incorporate innovation into the work that we're doing in order to stay competitive and, in our case, safe, right here at home.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, this program has been fortunate enough because we operate as the think and do tank for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Our ideas are briefed at the end of the year to the Chief of Staff, and then in more recent years, the Secretary of the Air Force, as well as senior leaders throughout the headquarters of the Air Force in the Pentagon and throughout the United States. So it gets a lot of visibility. And
yeah, for sure. And yeah, I think you describe what really happens is innovation within constraints. And so often, right, if we had an endless amount of money and an endless amount of time, like what would actually get done? Yeah, the opportunity is when you apply these kinds of constraints, and goodness knows you have constraints on the battlefield in a variety of different theaters and even at home, right? Just whether it's plugging through the bureaucracy or just trying to get approvals and yeses from people who matter. Yeah. So just for context, I had the good fortune of working with these incredible fellows on their storytelling and pitches that would one day be put in front of these incredible minds who are protecting us every day, and also just working through how to develop the story around really complex weapons, communications, defense systems, right? In the aggregate, certainly I don't have a security clearance, so having conversations that are sometimes obtuse, but really understanding that how we tell the story, even as we go through innovation, is so critical because we need lots of buy-in along the way, and we need to test our ideas as to whether or not, is this actually working? Are you actually getting it? Is this connecting with my audience? Can you talk a little bit about the selection process? So you are choosing technologies that do you already have in mind the technologies that you think are most critical given the threats that exist? Or do you leave it to the fellows to determine from their experience what's most needed and then put those forward?
sir, do you mind if I jump in on this one?
Go ahead, Eric.
So our starting point, and thank you so much for highlighting, the fellows are the real heroes in our organization. Each year we identify incredibly talented majors and lieutenant colonels, and sometimes a few colonels slip in, and they are the ones who are really leading the charge. Our starting point is identifying a worthy challenge. We do not let them talk about solutions early on. If they say, hey, I have a great idea, we're like, awesome, tell us about it after you've really narrowed down on what the problem is. So the fellows are forced to really focus primarily on what is the problem I'm trying to solve. And then along the way, as they learn about what's in the realm of the possible, then they start to vector in on a potential technological solution. And I mean, a few cases you might have fellows who have a lot of background in, say, AI development, or they have some background in the test and acquisitions community. But many of our fellows come across all different career fields. You have maintainers working with acquisitions officers, working with intelligence officers, and they don't have a deep background in the type of technology or the realm of the possible that, say, someone who's been working in laboratories for years or who's been on Silicon Valley for the last decade. So it's really up to the fellows to identify what's in the realm of the possible and identify advocates within the military, within the private sector, within academia who share their vision for trying to address this challenge, and then we'll apprise them of the potential opportunities that are emerging. So here, well-founded technology. One problem that we addressed a while ago was the issue of agile combat employment, ACE. It was essentially this idea that we needed to be able to operate in forward deployed bases on rough terrain that we couldn't necessarily get to. And a team of Air Force officers approached a company that was working with logging companies that were trying to keep dust down as these logging trucks were driving along. And they were like, well, okay, so you've generated this bacteria that can tamp down all this dust. Like, how hard can you make this bacteria? And the entrepreneurs who they were working with were like, well, how hard do you need this bacteria to be? And they were like, can we land a C-17 on it? And they were like, we will find out. So essentially, they work with this company that, and I should highlight at the beginning, it's not like the company knew that they were able to do it. They were involved in this task of uncertainty with these fellows, but essentially they developed a spray that was bacteria, for lack of a better term, that could grow runways. And so as long as you had clear fields, you
Amazing.
could essentially spray this bacteria down, harden local surfaces to the point where a C-17 could land on it. And then when you needed to pull up stakes and move to a different base, you sprayed a different bacteria or solution over top of it, and it dissipated. So it was environmentally friendly, it was very, very cost effective, and it reduced the need for us to bring very expensive construction equipment with us to build the runways we needed. It was very minimal impact. But importantly, the fellows weren't looking for a logging company in like rural North Carolina that had figured this out. Like, they were simply looking for a partner who's willing to identify a potential solution to this massive challenge that we're trying to address.
Yeah. This reminds me, my last guest was Steve Rader. The was the head, he just retired, of open innovation at NASA. And open innovation is, how do we bring others in from the outside, especially from industries that might not even be, us adjacent, to help us solve problems. And he often tells this story of the potato chip factory. And the problem with making potato chips is that oil sticks to the potato chip at the end. So when you dig your hand into the bag, you don't want to come up with an oily mess. And so this potato chip factory was trying to solve this industry-wide problem that, how do I get the last end of oil off the potato chips without breaking them? And so they wound up putting out a contest to answer this question, but they didn't want their competitors to know. And the question was, how do I remove a viscous substance from a fragile wafer? So this was the question posed, and it was surprisingly answered by a cellist who had the experience of rubbing resin on a bow, but then didn't want to, get the resin all over their fingers when they were playing. And it turns out you emit sound waves over the chips, and it separates the chip from the oil. And so a sonic wave was the answer to that. That's the bow. That's the bow across the cello. And so a cellist wound up solving that problem. And so you wind up finding that in innovation, there are answers to questions in people that you would never hire, that you would never bring on board full time. No potato chip factory needs a full-time cellist to answer their questions. And
they do now.
You're right. And they certainly need to think a sonic response was the way to get oil off a potato chip. But it's that kind of story. And like the one that you're telling is why we love working in innovation, and why it's amazing working with incredible fellows like yours who can find these dynamic answers to really vexing, very costly, very critical and urgent problems if we pick up our heads and look in other directions that we might not have otherwise. It's fascinating.
Well, it's funny you mention that because our fellows come from all walks of life. We
Mm.
don't, it's very often the experts in one area will very rarely that they'll actually come up with a solution to something that's in their subject matter expertise. Usually it's people from varied backgrounds that have no reason working on a project to come together. And that's why we bake in Imagineering into our innovations and into our projects, because we're not looking for the technical experts to solve something in their wheelhouse. We're looking for people from different walks of life to come together, like that cellist, to bring in music into potato chip making factory, the same way as we use that imaginary level of Imagineering for our fellows to approach something that they've never seen before, find bits and pieces that exist to combine those for a solution that no one would ever think about. So we're completely on board with that, and it's amazing how that comes together.
Yeah. So, and Eric, you were saying that the snowmobile is kind of like your mascot for Blue Horizons. Why is that?
So it actually comes from an analogy that was offered by a strategist within the Air Force, Colonel John Boyd, and he identified this as an allegory for an ability to solve complex problems by leveraging existing technology. So the snowmobile is basically a composite of skis attached to like a motorcycle engine with, I'm from the South, so I'm over my proverbial skis on this one and describing it. But you have tank treads that are put on the side of it to help it maneuver forward. So you bring all these component pieces together that would normally not necessarily be tied together to solve the challenge of like, how do you move across snowy field where very rapidly for a low cost? Yeah. So that
Yeah,
was, we took that from John Boyd.
that's like a Franken function. Yeah, you just got to put all the right pieces together and
Yeah.
make it work. Which feels like sometimes what you need to do on the fly, right? When you're in combat situations, when you're in really hostile territory. And some of the technologies that the fellows are working on are really about working in new places that we haven't been as combat forces, right? We're always expanding our ideas of what's possible. I think about corporate innovators thinking about addressing new markets, right? You are constantly addressing new threats. And that takes a different mindset as well. And adding on another layer to innovation is constantly thinking about we might think about competitors, but you're thinking about life or death competitors.
Absolutely. I think we spend a lot of time identifying, like I said, strategic challenges. Part of that is getting up to date intel briefs on what's occurring on the battlefield. And then some of the skill sets that we teach are strategic forecasting, right? So it's thinking through, or strategic foresight, thinking through not just what are the challenges that we're facing today, but what are some of those more subtle changes in society, technology, alliances abroad that might complicate our assumptions about what forces we can bring to bear, what technology we might have on hand. One of the greatest, at the start of the academic year, as we're digging into our content and trying to expand the aperture for the fellows, I asked them, like, what is, your favorite innovation from World War II? And everyone often will say, like, oh, like the challenge of developing a nuclear weapon, that was incredible. Or the evolution of radar is something, Air Force nerds, they love radar. So radar is something that they'll jump on top of. But one of the key innovations ahead of World War II was the development of synthetic rubber. And that was a huge challenge that our country was facing as Axis powers were cutting off our supply to the natural rubber. And this was a crucial threat because we needed rubber for our tires so planes could take off. We need rubbers in the factory. The Russian forces were essentially powered at the time by US trucks, and they needed rubber to be able to drive on. It's almost impossible to imagine that we would have been as successful if we didn't have synthetic rubber. But that was one of many innovations that had to occur at the time that are often overlooked, because these are those subtle elements that are crucial to the battlefield, that are crucial to mobility for our forces, that if our leaders hadn't been so keen to identify early on, we would have been in a very terrible situation.
Yeah. I'm a foodie, so I'm thinking MREs, like meals ready to eat. I've heard that they've evolved quite a bit over time. Is that true?
Yeah, they've gotten a lot better. They were used to be unpalatable and barely edible. Now it's almost compared to where they started, it's almost a gourmet meal.
Right. This is what I think of, like the military has brought to my camping store, is what I'm making when I camp now is everything that was tested on y'all first. So talk to us a little bit about innovation going right and innovation going wrong. And obviously constantly in the learning curve. I just came from the Innovators Conference in Arizona, and we're endlessly talking about the embrace of failure. It's not profit and loss, it's profit and learn. And I'm curious, what are some of the barriers that you find within the military to getting to yes, and the conversations that need to happen to get to yes? Because that's a universal challenge that all of us as innovators face.
So Eric, let me start off this one, and I think you've got more examples in your hip pocket. But so there are a myriad of challenges to get to yes, but part of the pieces that we instill and that our fellows go through are executive communication, because quite honestly, some of the ideas they're pitching are crazy. And without telling a story, capturing the imagination of the stakeholder, they're going to be either turned down or they'll turn off the stakeholder within minutes of starting the conversation, seconds of entering a room, because they could be labeled as crazy or just out to lunch. But it's really a lot of the executive communication about how they sell, how they capture the audience stakeholders' imagination to be able to convince them that this is a possibility, that this is a reality and can be done and can be prototyped. So almost like the innovation storytelling that you found your company on, it's how they're able to capture the imagination of the stakeholder to even get in the door. It's almost like a Shark Tank pitch, more capturing the imagination though, and really convincing someone it can be done, or that the impossible or improbable can actually be attempted. And so often that's the first piece, even before we get to trying and prototyping and failing. Very often they've got to convince them that it's worth their time, their effort, and their institutional inertia as a stakeholder to invest in their idea and in their ludicrous proposal. And often that's one of the hardest parts. But I'll let Eric talk about what's gone well and bad. But yeah, from my perspective, it's just getting your foot in the door and how well you can actually tell a story that'll get investment in your innovation or just in your idea.
Sir, I think you're politely in implying that I'm the expert on train wrecks, and I gladly wear that. We had this great quote from a senior leader who was talking to our fellows, and it really captured our imagination at the time when he said, there is not a lack of good ideas in the Pentagon. He's like, we have tons of good ideas in the Pentagon. What we have a lack of is our ability to communicate those ideas. And so there's a number of critical stakeholders throughout the Pentagon and the rest of our national security establishment who can help move the needle on challenges, but many of them lack the skill set or capacity or platform to be able to communicate those ideas to individuals who can make a difference on it. And so just to foot stomp what Colonel Ruttenberg was noting, that is one of the key challenges to success. Other challenges that we've noted are essentially starting with a solution first mentality. There's an organization that we often work with that I will not name, but essentially they dream up great technology and they present this technology and it's like, look, we've invented fire breathing koalas. And we're like, oh, that's interesting. What do you do with these fire breathing koalas? And they're like, well, whatever you want, it's a fire breathing koala. And for our sense, we're like, well, there's no clear problem identified here. Like what we actually needed was a robust architecture to support our GPS systems, because that's something that we rely on every day. And, as can be seen with a number of conflicts, if you don't have access to it, a number of assumptions that we've built about how we're going to deploy forces, how we're going to support ourselves, how do I even get to the fight? A lot of it relies on our modern GPS system. They're like, do we have a replacement for that? And they're like, no, we spent all our time on the fire breathing koala. And that's essentially where we're at. So I think for organizations that start with these nifty technologies that they've pulled up, and then they assume once we invest in this technology, it'll inevitably solve some problem. So we run into issues where there's great technology that's being developed by these organizations, but it's not really vectored toward a real battlefield challenge that we're facing or an immediate threat that we need to tackle. Another issue that we often run into is dreaming too small. There are a number of hurdles that we have to even work with our own fellows about trying to dream bigger. When I first started our organization, I used to try to diminish expectations of the fellows. I'm like, oh, I don't know if you're going to be able to handle information operations like in the future. Like, how are you going to develop a solution to address like misinformation promoted by an adversary in the battlefield? I was like, that's so amorphous, that's so challenging. But you'd be shocked by what can be accomplished with, you know, a couple of like whip smart majors, lieutenant colonels, and like $500,000 in their back pocket to prototype something. Like, they can come up with some amazing solutions and address much bigger problems. I think limiting the scope of what's able to be achieved is a critical hurdle for many of our innovators in the military. So allowing them the ability to shoot for the stars, and even if they miss, like, a lot to glean, and you learn a lot about the challenge to begin with.
Yeah. I was listening to an interview with Jeff Bezos, and he said, thinking small is a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I thought, wow, he went on to say that he believes that limiting yourself before starting the project is the recipe for failure, and that people often overestimate the potential downsides of taking risks and underestimate the potential rewards. And the failure is understanding the timeline. So we think small because we think our time frame is small, and we don't give ourselves the space to think bigger along a longer time horizon. And it's just a matter of finding the right stakeholders who can help carry the water to a longer finish line. And I think it's so indicative of the work that you're doing, is encouraging people to think big and finding the sponsors internally who can keep carrying the water for you as the idea gets bigger and has more and more impact.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So from a learning perspective, you've been going through this with numerous groups of fellows now, right? How many years have you had like a full-fledged, as Blue Horizons stood on its own as a full-fledged university?
So as a program, so we sit underneath Air War College in the Air University apparatus. We've been doing prototyping since I believe the fall of 2017.
Yeah.
So we've had a number of years to learn a number of challenges dealing with, say, the peculiarities of contracting inside the DoD, like understanding how money works, understanding some of the laws around, like for example, if anybody's worked with government contracting will understand this, you can't MIPR a MIPR, like rules like that are just not intuitive to the everyday person, but like our acquisitions professionals really understand. Those are a lot of the lessons we've learned having worked through the system. We've also, I think, learned that just because our service hasn't solved this problem doesn't mean that there aren't partners in the Navy or the Army or the new Space Force that haven't really moved the needle. We also, big lesson that we learned is that if you really want to have some voice and maturity and the capability to punch above your weight, it's in knowing essentially, for lack of a better term, you have to have the right classification level. You have to have these conversations with the appropriate read-ins to really have those conversations with key stakeholders, because the silos within our government are awfully large and it makes it difficult to collaborate. And until you're able to give people a view into everything that's actually being worked on inside the government, it's amazing what these fellows are able to accomplish, because we are given a certain amount of freedom and agency to dive into different problem sets, and they're able to connect a lot of those silos. And some of our early failures emerged because we didn't have those tickets to jump into those communities or that ability to work with these different various stakeholders. So those are I could keep going, a laundry list of failures. Again, of train wrecks, I've led quite a few of them. So I've got the battle scars to prove it.
So on the flip side of that, are there inventions and innovations that you'd be able to share with us that you're proud of?
Sure. I think we've got a couple of them. By way of disclaimer, kind of building on what Eric said, a lot of the things that the fellows work on are snowmobiles. And those snowmobiles, some of them, if they may be ahead of their time. It may take a couple years for the DoD to run into the problem that our fellows stumbled upon or discovered. And they already have essentially a prototype, a solution for that problem. So it's not uncommon for a Blue Horizons project to succeed brilliantly, but it be ahead of its time and really not be fully built out or appreciated or implemented for 2 to 3 years until or after they graduate, because they had their strategic foresight was such that they actually solved something that wasn't ready to be solved by the DoD yet or wasn't needed. The war in the Ukraine, things like that no one could have seen coming require advances or innovations that weren't part of our repertoire 2 to 4 years ago to 10 years ago. So that's really cool to see what the fellows do. One of the current academic years fellows is working on data analytics, human machine teaming for battle management. Really what they discovered was, if you think back to how you and I used to do a road trip, we did it with pen and paper and atlas and a paper atlas and flipping the pages and trying to navigate from one place to another using a bound atlas. Now we have Google Maps. Google Maps will figure out your rest stops along the area, food, weather, traffic, you name it. A lot of our air battle managers and our warfighters right now in the Air Force are using pen and paper to annotate things and solve things in flight. And they sought to really bring the Google Maps efficiency and effectiveness to air battle management, to be able to provide a human machine teaming and data analytics so that the software on a tablet could really orient and assess, so the operator, the mission commander, could do the decide and act part and take the cognitive load away from the person flying the airplane or the person in control of managing the battle space, and use data analytics and human machine teaming to do that. Something that we've been doing for a decade now with Google Maps and Waze. They decided to bring that to an airborne platform and an airborne mission commander with data analytics and human machine teaming, just because they asked why. Why are we still using paper and pencil in flight in a moving aircraft? Why don't we have something like Google Maps that can assess the red threat, the blue threat, all the pieces of the puzzle, put it together, and give you in seconds what would normally take 10 to 20 minutes for a human to reason through and to solve. So that's an example of something that the current class, one of the teams, is working on that just totally blew our mind.
Yeah, fascinating, right? And it's one of those things where you're like, wait, we didn't have this all along? On the outside, right? Our question is, and who knows how much further these concepts will go with the inclusion of artificial intelligence and agentic AI, and not to mention the security systems that have to go along with all of those to keep this brilliant information safe. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think, thinking about inside the military versus externally, what do you think the characteristics of a great innovation fellow at Blue Horizons are? Like, what are those criteria that you look for when you're selecting fellows?
That's a lot of fun. Eric, you've seen more than a couple of classes of folks come through. We really look for, and so Eric can put my small words into actually very colorful attributes, but we look for unicorns. We look for people that aren't A, satisfied with the status quo, that B, aren't afraid of challenges. And I think the last part is that they're willing to be Imagineers. There aren't just, when we tell them to get from A to Z, they don't go through the steps. They want to stop at F. They may drive by Y, but they're not going to go in order. They're going to think outside the box. They're going to think not why, but how. And those are some of the big picture attributes we look for at a macro level. But for the actual specifics, Eric, you've seen more than a few classes. What would you say that we look for or that have stood out to you for attributes of good fellows in innovation?
Yeah. So with full disclosure, our amazing faculty colleague, Tony Franks, has been leading recruiting the last couple of years. He's just been doing an amazing job with that. So maybe you can jump in at some point in the future and clear up anything I mess up. But the big things that we often look for are diverse experiences. So we're not just looking for an emergency room doctor who's in the Air Force. We're interested in an emergency room doctor who was a maintainer prior to going to med school. So like an actual fellow that we had who worked on Air Force, like worked in maintenance and then made the transition to be an ER doc. Like that's something that stands out for us.
Right.
Do they, have they switched careers? A red flag for us is if they basically spent their entire time doing one job without necessarily expanding their repertoire, which has really limited their scope. So it's something that we that can raise a red flag for us. We're also looking for people who are collaborative. When someone applies, the first thing that we do, I've just been amazed. I'm a dumb political scientist, didn't have a military background before working here, But I've just been amazed that the Air Force as an organization that's massive just feels like a small village, like everybody knows everybody. So the first time we identify someone who's of interest to us, we call people from inside their community and we people they've served with, and we ask them questions like, are they collaborative? Like, how do they work well in a team? Like, what do they do under high pressure situations? Are they, someone who will provide top cover for their teammates, or are they someone who will kick down? Like, those are the, red flags for us, because we work in such a high pressure environment. It's a very stressful. We ask so much of these fellows, and we put them in such a challenging place that we need someone who's going to be a solid teammate. And I think we've just been so fortunate that we've been able to identify a great groups of collaborative fellows who come together to support one another, because there is no distinguished graduate for Blue Horizons. Like, they're all equally amazing in my opinion, but that's the ethos and attitude. Like, we all succeed and fail together. So even if it's not your project that you're working on, you're constantly looking out for people inside your cohort to make sure that they can succeed. And so this year in particular, it's just been emblematic of that degree of success, because I think when innovation occurs in a collaborative environment, much more can be accomplished.
So I guess we'll put out a clarion call to all of the majors and lieutenant colonels who fit the criteria that you just described to apply for next year's program, because I'm just blown away by the talent, traveling all over the world, talking to innovators everywhere on the corporate side and on the entrepreneurial side. I've never been in a room with people named like Breezy or Zigzag or, all different kinds of amazing nicknames of call names, as we're sitting in the classroom. But the level of talent and thoroughness of thought through the idea is phenomenal. And I'm also want to be thinking about my listeners and folks in our corporate audience who might be able to support your efforts. And I know that you take trips to incredible organizations to understand innovation systems inside of large corporates and other large organizations, and not to mention startups, accelerators, incubators. This is all part of the education that's happening inside of Blue Horizons. How can my listeners support your effort? How can we invite Blue Horizons in to share what we've learned and to learn from all of you?
I think we are interested in companies who are willing to take a risk on collaborating with the government and the DoD. It's not always easy to partner with government entities and to get started, mainly because the challenges that we often face are very, very large. And the timelines with government contracting can be, I guess, say, a bit of a struggle. It can be a bit of a struggle to collaborate with the government. But with that said, like, the rewards tend to be very high with this idea that, you're really contributing to national security. And we look for companies that are willing to be partners with us. Now, granted, neither of us are acquisitions officers, so we're not able to obligate the US government, but we're always looking for companies willing to at least have a conversation to identify what they're working on and want to know how best they can support US national security, because that is the reason we get up and get out of bed each morning, is we're excited about helping make America safer and empowering these fellows to do their best to ensure that we're prepared for a conflict in the 21st century, if one to occur, and at best, if we can deter an adversary in the future.
Yeah. And I just thought it was fantastic. So I'm calling on my fellow innovators to think about, if you have innovation labs, if you have incredible workspaces that these fellows could come and tour and see live and really ask deep questions about how innovation is getting done in the private sector. Not to mention my friends with incubators and accelerators about how we get this ideation moving forward faster, all the better. So I just want to thank both of you for being on the show today. And what is the best way for people to get in touch if they want to connect with you?
Well, Susan, I think that first, thanks for offering to provide a letter of reference for us or a pitch for us. Those
Always.
incubators, those innovation engines, really is where we would love to interact with, because often more is caught than taught. And just the engagements between innovators, innovation engines, or innovation labs is where we really find the inspiration or the partnership going forward, because we from the DoD often are disaggregated, separated from the corporate America or those true innovation engines. So the more we conduct that exchange of ideas, the better off we are able to actually think outside the box and incorporate a lot of the fail fast and a lot of the incredible work being done outside the DoD into some of the DoD's hardest problems. So yeah, we would take any and all interaction, and we do seek out those innovation hubs, whether it's universities or corporations that have those, to be able to further help the DoD get out ahead of itself and outside the box, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks for
Absolutely.
cleaning up my word salad on that one.
I'm now going to conclude the conversation with the 3 questions I ask every guest who comes on the show. What is the greatest innovation of all time? What's your opinion?
So if I were to go greatest innovation of all time, I'd have to say the light bulb, because thinking back to storytelling, before we had light, we were limited by how many days or hours of daylight in the day. And really that enabled us to actually expand what we do. And it was just, I think without that, we'd still be in eras of and decades of darkness. So I'll go with the light bulb medicine.
Eric, what do you think?
Well, being from Kentucky, I'd probably say bourbon, but outside of that,
That's to shut out the lights. That's to go completely blackout on your own.
You know, obviously, I was a big fan of synthetic rubber earlier, but I would
That's Edison's also from his lab. His initial lab created the first synthetic rubber, I believe.
Yeah, I would also, the classic is printing press, right? Like, how do you dramatically reduce the cost of information being shared and passed along? And that's of critical importance. So I think, that, and as a political scientist, I'm always a big fan of, like, Hammurabi's code, like written law, like something that, can deviate responsibilities inside civil society and organizations. That's always like super important for future. It's also like, if you've ever read Darren Acemoglu and Robinson, like we know that like these are, you help build the environment for innovation ecosystems by the governance that goes into creating these fertile areas. So it's something that's often overlooked. But as a political scientist, that's my plug.
Love it. Got to have a political scientist on more often, clearly, because no one's ever mentioned Hammurabi's code. So thank you. If you could join any innovation team throughout human history, which team would you have joined?
Ooh, this one's fun. Probably the Skunk Works that developed the SR-71, the Mach 3 Plus biplane, because they developed an airplane using pencils and slide rules that was developed before computers were a thing, and developed something of that breathtaking aeronautical engineering and true innovation before the current day that is yet to be surpassed or even rivaled. And it's been retired for how many years now? So that would, Kelly Johnson, Skunk Works, and his crew are kind of like the yesteryears of the current SpaceX. And so that would be a really cool innovation team to join.
Wow. It wasn't until I saw that movie, Hidden Figures, did I learn that humans were called computers. Those women, were called the computers. And they were the ones just doing all the math behind the, our manned missions to space. What about you, Eric? What team would you have joined?
I think Operation Warp Speed with the development of the COVID vaccine, it's so interesting because, we had invested in this technology that was really coming to the forefront that, was really waiting for a time and place to distinguish itself. So the technology was largely there, but I think Operation Warp Speed underscored a lot of policy and logistical hurdles that had to be solved. And thinking about innovation, like we often look for like the moonshot or the enabling technology is the one thing that everybody gets excited about, but often the processes and the policies in place to help make this something that's applicable to everyday life often gets overlooked. And I think, in maybe it's just availability and recency bias, but I think going through and watching, 2 administrations, people from both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have to navigate those challenges and really identify all of the logistical hurdles necessary to expand this as quickly as possible to help bring the pandemic to an end. That was just amazing to watch. I don't know what I could have brought to the team. Maybe I would have made coffee, but it would have been really exciting just to be a fly on the wall, just to observe what was going on.
All I could think about now is the Nutella team. And I think I would have joined that one. Like now that you've mentioned it at the beginning of this, like it's pretty much all that's been on my mind. So, and solving that cocoa issue, you know, we could have done something about that. What is a problem that you wish could be solved with innovation now, something that really pisses you off, or something that you wish you could bring to the world to make it better?
Man, I think solving rush hour in a city where there is no mass transit, there is no ability to redevelop land or things like that. I think solving rush hour in a landscape or constrained environment without remaking the entire city, without having to burrow underground, some way to solve that would be incredible. Maybe we're pitching for flying cars next or elevated expressways. But yeah, solving rush hour without destroying the entire, for lack of better words, city around it would be incredible.
Colonel, I know the comments I'm going to get on that statement is, where are my jetpacks? And it's going to be directed to you in the Air Force. So this is what we need to redirect our cities so they're not so. I was promised a jetpack as a Gen Xer, and yet we are still waiting for the mass rollout of the jetpack, or at minimum, an Iron Man suit. When are we going to see this? Can I ask the innovators of the Air Force to answer that question for us? We all want to know.
Oh, I wish tomorrow.
We're the fellows who are solving the jetpack problem. This is what we really want. Eric, what do you think?
I think, one thing that I guess is a little close to home is our current acquisition timelines. And this is going to be super bureaucratic and nerdy, so I apologize for your listeners. But like if we could solve one way to reduce the uncertainty with long-term planning for the military, I think that would be, particularly with budgetary cycles, that would be Herculean. Another, on the flip side, I think, the other side is we get into these long-term acquisition processes and projects that make it very difficult for us to be adaptive moving forward. And so essentially, like you're planning for a future war just with data based on the past war. And that's how you can get, prototypes or new novel capabilities that were designed during the war on terror that we have to now think about, like, well, what is its role in great power competition? So if there was some way for us to at least, wave a magic innovation wand to make our organization more adaptable, to bring in these new ideas during the development process, to where we're not so shackled by past expectations, I think that would be an amazing accomplishment for U.S. national security. So if I could wave my magic wand, I would give us more insight for long-term planning and more confidence that, say, money will be there for the investments that we're making. And then at the same time, I'd want us to be more flexible, to bring in that novel technology to make us more adaptable so that we can adjust as technology becomes relevant and usable.
Amazing. Okay, if my listeners want to get in touch with you and help with making these connections, what's the best way to connect with you?
I think just Google or any search for the Center for Strategy and Technology or Blue Horizons Fellowship. That'll bring you right to our website. That's always a work in progress, but forever there. So, and they can get contact information through there, and that's the best way to find us.
Yeah, and that's better than LinkedIn, or?
It is for now. Yep.
Fantastic. Well, Colonel Ruttenberg, Eric Keels, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. It has been an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you. And I'm keeping this sticker. I'm keeping it close to me all the time. This is my U.S. Air Force Blue Horizon sticker, and it's right on my desk looking at me every day. I'm thinking about you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Appreciate it, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you.